This is Faithful Sayings, broadcast by the Leon Valley Church of Christ. Will Rogers has a quote that I really like. He says, "Too many folks spend money that they don't have for stuff they don't need to impress people they don't like." And that so perfectly encapsulates so much of our culture, unfortunately. You know, Solomon was one of the wealthiest people who ever lived, and he collected silver, gold, and he says the treasures of kings and provinces in Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 11. And yet he said, "Behold, all was vanity and a striving after the wind, and there was no profit under the sun." So you read the second chapter of Ecclesiastes to get a fuller take on his attitude toward his personal wealth and the many indulgences he experienced and the things that he just didn't deny himself. He really lived a life of luxury. Long story short, Solomon knew the folly of unregulated spending, and he knew that there was no joy ultimately to be found in things and stuff and just getting more stuff. He says in verses 9 and 10 that he refused his eyes nothing that they desired. So he didn't refuse himself anything. He didn't withhold any pleasure from his heart, also his words. And so some of his purchases included male and female singers and slaves and properties and multiple homes and orchards and vineyards, confections and concubines, all kinds of things that you can read about there. And he says, I didn't deny myself any of it. And so he just totally went bonkers because he could. You know, you talk about lifestyles of the rich and famous. Solomon knew extravagance. And at the same time, he is honest about the utter dissatisfaction found in materialism and a materialistic lifestyle and outlook, and the foolishness of being a spendthrift. So that's our introduction for today, and we want to look at some more scriptures now as we think about more financial wisdom from the book of Proverbs. God desires his people to be self-controlled. That's a general principle found in a lot of places, Galatians 5:23 being one of them there in the fruits of the Spirit. So those who are led by the Spirit of God and submit to the Spirit of God seek for this self-control and self-discipline, right? It's the fruit of obeying his will. And self-control is foundational to living righteously as a follower of Jesus Christ. In Luke 9:23, he talks about a true disciple, denying himself and taking up his cross daily. And Solomon too will say in Proverbs 25 that a person without self-control is like a city whose walls have been broken through. And his point is that we can easily find ourselves overwhelmed with the consequences of not having self-control. And he's not talking specifically about finances in that proverb. It's just or in Galatians 5:23, it's just a general principle of self-control exercised in all areas of life. But it's certainly true of finances, which is our focus and has been for the last few podcasts on our Proverbs series regarding finances. And so as we move forward, we're thinking more about the financial wisdom Solomon puts before us. And one of those is to control our spending. Proverbs 21 and verse 5, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty." And so that hasty, impulsive, unplanned kind of spending has brought many families to poverty and bankruptcy. And if it hasn't taken them that far, it's made things very difficult in their lives and their relationships and their provisions for their family. You know, you live in paycheck to paycheck, and maybe you don't have to do that. And one of the reasons that you are is because you're spending too much, and you're making all these unplanned purchases based on impulse, and you're being hasty. And I can sympathize with that. Surely I know a lot of people can, because we just enjoy getting new things, and there's nothing wrong with even desiring new things. But the point is that we have to control our spending. We have to use wisdom and exercise the diligence that Solomon talks about here in Proverbs 21 and elsewhere that leads to advantage. So, and being content. So we've talked about, get rich quick schemes previously in this series. And I think this verse would certainly apply to that, not being hasty and, a quote, investment without proper and thorough research, that can lead people to financial hardship and ruin. The wise man lives by a budget, which is simply a plan, right? A budget is simply a plan for how someone is going to allocate their money. And there's wisdom in that. I believe that's what Solomon is saying here. And however, simply having a budget, having that plan is not going to automatically increase your savings and stability. It says the plans of the diligent. And so we think about the attitude that goes along with the plans that Solomon is talking about. So have a plan, and then he says be diligent. That leads to advantage. And so biblical wisdom exercised doesn't just have a plan, but it is diligence in executing that plan. The foolish have often, too much month left at the end of the money because of impulsive, unplanned purchases, and it can be totally avoided. A failure to meet our obligations financially can be avoided if we strive to be wiser, more diligent stewards of our money and possessions. And that takes determination, even a kind of grit, if you want to call it that, to control our spending. Right? It's a denial of self and our own desires, because we face a stream of commercials just everywhere, all the time. It's just enticing us to the latest and greatest gizmos and any number of things. Proverbs 14:15 says, "The naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his steps." Right? All those advertisers and commercials, they're out there for a reason. Everybody wants your money. Everybody does. And that's never going to change. At least it feels that way. And so Solomon is saying that those who are financially wise, according to Scripture, are less likely to be taken in by salesmen and ads and commercials who try to use flattery or feign friendship or pressure tactics or the rosy picture they paint and whatever it is they're trying to sell, about whatever it is they're trying to sell, I guess I should say. And I'm not saying that we make poor choices financially or make needless purchases because of salesmen. Or commercials. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that that's a bad business or don't go into that. But the point is that they're designed to convince you a lot of times to buy something they don't necessarily need. Right? They're trying to sell a product. Maybe it is a good product. Maybe you could make use of it, and it would be a good investment, or whatever the case may be. But a lot of times, we just are naive and we believe everything, and we just have these delusions of grandeur, and we think we're going to get in shape in 5 days, and so we spend $1,000 on a Bowflex or something like that. We're just hasty and impulsive, and we're naive, and we're not being diligent in financially sound, making financially sound decisions. Anyone who's determined to live beyond his means doesn't need a salesman to help him get there. So I'm not trying to pass the buck. I'm just saying, if we live for endless pleasure, comfort, and entertainment, there's plenty of ways to overextend ourselves and get into trouble with credit cards. So Proverbs 22:17, "He who loves pleasure will become a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not become rich." So we don't have to eat out every night or buy something from Amazon every day or go on vacations we can't afford in order to keep up with the Joneses. That is indicative of, first of all, pride and, trying to win the rat race, get in the rat race. But Solomon is also saying it's indicative of someone who's living for pleasure, who loves pleasure. In verse 17 of Proverbs 22, he's saying, make no mistake, if you do that, and many people do, and sacrifice a whole lot and go into debt, he says you're going to become poor. If you love those things, if you live for those things. And remember, Proverbs are generalizations, right? They're axioms that, there's exception to these rules, but generally speaking, they are true. And so, he's saying that if we find ourselves chasing after these things, trying to outdo someone else, that's our pride talking, that's our vanity talking, and we just need to quit. True wealth And satisfaction biblically is always found in relationships, and no greater relationship exists than that what we can have with Jesus Christ, in whom, Paul says, are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And he says in John 16:24 that he came to make our joy complete. And so we need to find relevance and satisfaction in him, and immerse ourselves in his word and the promises that he puts before us, and store up treasures in heaven, and look for those spiritual things that are so much more valuable and so much more enjoyable and lasting than anything we can buy on the internet or anywhere else for that matter with physical money. God indicted his people in Isaiah, and I don't have the passage in front of me right now, but he says, why do you spend money for bread that doesn't satisfy? And, come to me, he says, and that's my paraphrase, and you'll have to investigate for yourself. But it's not a new problem, and it's a principle we can see time and time again in Scripture that's made. Go to God to find true, lasting joy and peace and comfort. A lot of all the things that we are usually looking for in stuff, or money itself, right? That kind of security, peace of mind, happiness, and it's just a lie. It's just a lie. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money. Nor he who loves increase with its income. And that's my paraphrase of Ecclesiastes 5:10 and 11. So check that verse out. But biblically, time and time again, we're told satisfaction is not found there. Another point that comes through Proverbs again is avoid debt. Avoid debt. Proverbs 22:7. The borrower becomes slave to the lender. The borrower becomes the lender's slave. So when so many of us seem to be looking for ways to accrue more debt and, get the latest credit card that has, 0 APR for 12 months, which is to encourage spending, right? It's encouraging you to overextend yourself. The Bible is saying, don't dig the hole any deeper, right? You've got debt already. Likely, if you're like most Americans, according to the latest statistics, you have a mountain of debt already. And we can, it's the Bible's perspective is that we're enslaved. In other words, we have that obligation to that lender. That money is tied up in a consumer-driven economy with every other person offering a new line of credit. There's opportunities, that abound to overspend. And some are so burdened with debt that they spend their working hours earning money just to pay their creditors, right? So they never get ahead. It's usually at a high rate of interest, right? We've seen that. We know this. And what's worse is that, this is something that's often celebrated. People can brag about their FICO score. That's not something to brag about, right? It's just that's something that just shows your relationship to your debt, right? So if you have a high score, well, then means you've had a lot of debt that you paid back. And the wise man does pay his obligations promptly, Proverbs 3:27 and 28. And his spending is not determined by what he desires or the amount of credit he is offered, but by his actual means and needs. That's the difference, right? So there's I'm not saying that accruing debt is sinful, and that's another study in and of itself. It's not to say that having debt is sinful in and of itself. I have a study where I deal with that question in more detail, and you can feel free to contact me using our website or leonvalleychurch.org or our email address, leonvalleychurch@gmail.com. I monitor that address. So, but not to get into that, but I'm not saying that debt is sinful. But for the sake of space, I'm cutting this part of the discussion short. But as a general rule, we should avoid going into debt, right? And make sure that we're able to meet the obligations that we have with our current means so that we don't overextend and extend ourselves and overspend and just dig the hole deeper. And so one great way to avoid debt is to anticipate future expenses. This is something the Bible speaks to. During the time of harvest, the ant prepares for the winter. That's the illustration that Solomon uses in Proverbs 6 and verse 8. He says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, and consider her ways, that she has no chief or master, and yet, and he focuses on her work ethic, that she is preparing for the winter, and she's storing up, right? Fools spend all of their income and more on payday, right? So they make no future plans. They're gambling it away, or they're making any of the foolish choices that we've already talked about. So those who are wise biblically are going to prepare for the future by gradually and steadily accumulating savings through hard work and discipline. Proverbs 13:11, wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but the one who gathers by labor increases it. Right, so we gather from our labors good, honest work that is acceptable to God, and then our wealth increases that way as we store up and save and plan for the future. So a man who handles his finances with wisdom and integrity can be a blessing to his posterity. Right, and that's part of the discussion about preparing for the future also. Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. So in the end, we can take none of our physical things with us. Naked we came into the world, naked we must leave. Godliness with contentment is great gain. We can't take any of it with us. What has lasting value, what is true wealth, again, for us and our children, are our spiritual blessings that are found in Christ Jesus. All that we can accrue in this life can't be exchanged for any of that. It can't be exchanged for salvation on Judgment Day. It can't be bought. That gift can only be obtained through Christ, who gave himself to redeem us from all wickedness. We are to be good stewards here and now and manage our resources well. That includes our money as well as our time, and any other number of things we can mention. We focused on finances this morning, or today rather. But ultimately, Christ gave himself to redeem us from all wickedness, and that's the greatest gift and teaching we can give to our children. So first of all, we want to ask ourselves, have we done that? Have we obeyed his gospel? And do we continue in faithfulness to him so that we can have the treasure in heaven that he himself spoke of? And do we teach our children to prioritize that, to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all things shall be added unto them? The physical blessings that we've discussed previously, earlier in the week, of the needs that God promises to meet. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Jason Garcia, and this has been Faithful Sayings.